Some survival stories are so extraordinary that they seem impossible. From extreme weather to deadly accidents, these people defy death in ways that challenge logic. Get ready for unbelievable survival stories that defy all odds. Triumph in the Arctic. You'd think out of all the people who would survive in the Arctic, a cook and seamstress isn't one of them. No disrespect to cooks and seamstresses, of course, but the story of 23-year-old Ada Blackjack is astonishing. This Inupiat woman was only supposed to play a supporting role in a 1920s expedition, alongside four determined explorers, plus one cat, who wanted to reclaim Wrangel Island in Russia for the British Empire. They got into trouble, and Ada was left as the only survivor. She had to spend 2 years fending for herself in the frozen wastes. Oh, and if you're wondering what happened to the cat, it survived also. Crisis on the Mexican coast. Salvadoran fisherman Jose Salvador Alvarenga spent an incredible 438 days stranded in the Pacific after a storm blew him way off course from his usual fishing route in 2012. There was a fellow sailor with him, Ezekiel Cordoba, who sadly died from a lack of food and water. Facing this devastating tragedy, Alvarenga consumed a diet of fish and turtles before being rescued. Shackleton's fate. The Shackleton expedition of 1914 is a classic story of survival. Sir Ernest Shackleton and his crew wanted to cross the expanse of the Antarctic in their ship the Endurance. Unfortunately, the conditions proved too harsh. The vessel was trapped in the ice. And if that wasn't enough, the pressure from the ice destroyed the Endurance in late 1915. The men needed to jump in a lifeboat and try to seek rescue. This didn't happen for months, with multiple attempts made to retrieve the men in mid to late 1916. The most amazing thing is that everyone survived. Apollo 13. 13 was a particularly unlucky number for NASA's Apollo crew of Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and John Swigert. In 1970, they blasted off to the moon, only to experience a near disaster when an oxygen tank blew up. This led to the astronauts using the Aquarius lunar lander as somewhere to shelter. The lander was reportedly a tight squeeze. Also, it lacked a shield to withstand the extreme heat from re-entry. Lovell and his friends needed to return to the stricken Odyssey spacecraft and pilot it back down to Earth. They finally landed in the Pacific, shaken up and no doubt grateful to be alive. Luckiest man in the desert. It takes a tough person to run a 6-day marathon across the Sahara Desert, so I can only imagine what Italian policeman and competitor Mauro Prosperi was feeling when he was hit by a sandstorm and became lost. This happened back in 1994, and Prosperi endured 9.5 days out in the sand. He found shelter in an old shrine and survived for a while on bats and his own urine. Prosperi then decided to end it all, but the desert wouldn't let him. He slit his wrists, only for the hot conditions to dry and seal the cuts. By the time he found civilization, he was 35 pounds lighter. Buried alive. Being buried alive isn't just something that happens in horror stories. In a shocking case from 2012, a woman in West Yorkshire, England was attacked with a taser before being buried alive in a cardboard container. One of the worst details about this story is that the attacker was her own partner. Thankfully, she escaped by cutting her way out using her engagement ring. The attacker received a 20-year prison sentence. Underwater survival. Ship's cook Harrison O'Keefe spent an extraordinary 3 days in an air pocket after his tugboat went down in 2013. The Jaskin flipped over when it was hit by a wave. Trapped under the ocean off the coast of Nigeria, O'Keefe found an unusual place to shelter, namely a toilet. It wasn't his choice. The water pressure pushed him inside. The toilet then filled almost to the top, leaving him approximately 4 square feet of space to breathe. Air guitar champ ordeal. James Michael Grimes must have been feeling pretty pleased with himself after winning an air guitar competition whilst on a cruise ship traveling between New Orleans and the Mexican island of Cozumel in 2022. His celebrations didn't last though, as he somehow fell in the sea and the ship left him behind. Grimes then had to keep his head above water for 15 agonizing hours, as well as battling exhaustion. He chewed a stick he found for sustenance. He also had to fend off a fish that ran into him, increasing his fear levels because he thought it was a shark. Man versus bear versus wilderness. Fur trader Hugh Glass was attacked by a furry predator in 1823. A grizzly bear nearly killed him in South Dakota while he was out working as part of an expedition. Did his fellow traders help him? Did they hell? Glass was put in a shallow grave and abandoned. He'd been ripped apart by the bear and also suffered a knee fracture. The poor man had to travel hundreds of miles to seek help. This involved crawling along due to his weakened state. Hugh Glass's story of survival inspired the movie The Revenant, starring Leonardo DiCaprio from 2015. Miracle on Sula Grande. It must be one of the hardest decisions you'll ever have to make. Assuming a friend of yours has died and taking action to save your own life. Up on Sula Grande in the Andes, climber Simon Yates was in that situation. He needed to cut the rope that connected him and Joe Simpson, who'd broken his leg during a descent in 1985. But shockingly, Simpson wasn't dead. He picked himself up and returned to base camp, though he was in a terrible state and it took him 3 days. There were no hard feelings against Simon Yates, though. Simpson stated he would have done the same thing himself. Tornado Rider. In 2007, a German paraglider was doing her thing when she became caught in a violent storm that nearly threw her into oblivion. Ava Wisniewska found herself shot over 32,000 feet up when training for the Australian Paragliding World Championship. She lost consciousness for 30 minutes during her ordeal. Ava was in an environment that was super cold at 58 F. Giant hailstones added to the threat. Despite all this, she woke up and flew back down to Earth. Surgery in the snow. Appendicitis can strike out of the blue. However, for Dr. Leonid Rogozov, it struck out of the white. He was in the Antarctic as part of a Soviet team in 1961. They were supposed to be building a base, but when Dr. Rogozov made a self-diagnosis of appendicitis, he needed to act fast. So he performed painful surgery to remove the appendix himself. Because this happened during the Cold War, the team had to get official permission before he could slice open his abdomen. 2 weeks later, he was back at work. Mawson's mission, Sir Douglas Mawson, an English explorer based in Australia, was on an expedition in Antarctica in 1912 when things went terribly wrong. His small team encountered disaster when Army man Belgrave Ninnis fell to his death down a crevasse, taking some of their huskies with him. Essential supplies were also lost, meaning Mawson and his remaining team member Xavier Mertz had to eat one of the dogs. Mertz became ill and died. Meanwhile, Mawson went snowblind. He was finally rescued after weeks trapped out in the cold. 69 days underground. 33 Chilean miners became some of the luckiest people alive in 2010. You may remember the news about the situation where their mine in the Atacama region collapsed, sealing them underground. They spent a total of 69 days in this nightmare, and their rescue was pretty stressful also. They had to get inside a capsule that only held one person and be pulled to the surface via a winch. They all survived, to the relief of their families, plus people watching worldwide. Amazon jungle survival. The name Yossi Ginsberg became famous in 1981 after he survived 3 weeks alone in the rainforest. He was inspired by the French writer Henri Charrière, who'd famously escaped from prison and lived with a tribe. Sadly, Ginsberg's experience proved to be upsetting rather than exciting. He was part of a group that didn't get along. The situation was dire, and they had to eat monkeys. And when he and Kevin Gale decided to travel on a raft, they were separated by the river's powerful current. Ginsberg faced dangers, such as a jaguar and worms in his face. His foot went rotten and he could easily have died from infection. Fortunately, he was rescued by a search party, which included his lost friend Kevin Gale. Surviving the Taliban. All Malala Yousafzai wanted to do as a young girl was educate herself. The The Taliban had other ideas, so they actually shot this 15-year-old in the head to try and silence her for good. Incredibly, she survived the 2012 attack, which turned her into a world-famous figure. 2 years later, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Malala went on to study at Oxford University, and today she runs a production company, beating Everest. American Beck Weathers was left in freezing conditions on Mount Everest when his fellow climbers believed him to be dead. His group got caught in a blizzard on the way down, resulting in temperatures of 60. Miraculously, Weathers survived, though parts of his nose, feet, and hands were destroyed by frostbite. 8 climbers died, with 12 deaths across the season. Weathers was up there during his 20th wedding anniversary. Maybe he wishes he'd stayed at home under the circumstances. Deep frozen driver. It sounds like a scene from a comedy, but this was an incredible true story of survival in the cold. Jean Hilliard was just 19 when she got into a car accident in icy conditions in the fall of 1980. She made it to a ranch in Minnesota where the incident happened. But by that point, poor Jean had turned into a living ice sculpture. While the situation looked crazy, she was rescued and the ice melted. She made a full recovery, with only some blisters to show for it. Morgue baby, Luz Milagros Veron from Argentina, had a shocking start in life. This little baby ended up on a slab in the morgue in 2012. Why? Because they'd been born prematurely, and the doctors thought they were stillborn. Parents Analia and Fabian were stunned to find out the infant was alive. And what's more, it's very cold in that morgue. Atomic survival. Tsutomu Yamaguchi is arguably the most incredible survivor on our list. He survived not just one, but 2 atomic blasts in 1945. These were the devastating attacks on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Allies' atomic bombs led to Japan's surrender and stopped World War II, but they left behind a scene of total devastation. To add insult to injury, Tsutomu Yamaguchi's boss didn't believe him after the first bombing, despite the fact he was bloodied and wearing bandages. These incredible survivors proved that the human spirit knows no limits. Which story amazed you the most? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more mind-blowing facts. Stay curious.